as possible at the end later on.
I do want to thank our Clean Lakes 101 sponsors today, presenting sponsor, National Guardian Life Insurance Company, our hosting sponsor, the East Side Club, supporting sponsors, Johnson Financial Group, Alliant Energy, and Perkins Coie, production partners, the UW Institute for Environmental Studies, the UW Extension, and the media partner, WKOW. Now, before we get started, very important announcement. The bar is open. Some of you have already discovered that. Those of you not, it's right back that way. I encourage everyone to grab a cookie also over in that corner close to the bar. So you can do this both in one stop. The cookies were purchased from Feed Bakery. It's a local program for unemployed residents of Dane County by providing valuable baking training and job placement services. They're also very good cookies. And for those of you who did receive a yellow ticket upon arrival, we do want to thank you for being a 2026 friend of Clean Lakes Alliance. When you become a friend, you get one free Bill's Two-Hearted IPA at every Clean Lakes 101 this year, which is a pretty good setup this year. You can become a friend today. This isn't something that's hyper exclusive. You can do it online, or you can talk to Brian or Olivia back that way, and they will be able to help you out at that check-in table right out the front door. Your support helps fuel programs and partnerships that continue to focus on improving water quality, lake access, and community engagement like this throughout the watershed. I do have a few quick updates for you before we get going. Registration is now open for Clean Lake Alliance's State of the Lakes event on Wednesday, May 13th at the Edgewater. We were just talking about this. The State of the Lakes is Clean Lakes Alliance's annual health synopsis of Greater Madison's 5 Yahara lakes: Mendota, Monona, Wingra, Wabisa, and Kaganza. More information can be found on the Clean Lakes Alliance website. And back to today's talk. We'll bring it back in now. To share more information about our lake's Clearwater phase, we have Hilary Dugan. Hilary Dugan is an associate professor at the Center for Limnology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. As a limnologist, Hilary studies how terrestrial and atmospheric changes like warming air, temperatures, land use patterns alter biogeochemical fluxes and aquatic processes in our lakes. Her research focus is on temperate and polar lakes, with sites spanning from Wisconsin to Antarctica, which is very cool. Here to share more about the mystery of spring's clear water phase in Wisconsin lakes, please join me and welcome me, Hilary Dugan.
Thank you, Dana, for that wonderful introduction. Everyone can hear me all right? I don't have a beautiful broadcasting voice. Following up Dana's hard. Yes, thank you all for being here today. This is a talk that I was asked to give on the Clearwater phase, which is the perfect time of year to dive into that. It's a little bit like a limnology lecture that I teach my undergrad, so bear with me if things get a little bit too textbook limnology, but hopefully that's what you're here for. And that being said, just a PSA, I teach an undergrad limnology class every year at UW-Madison. Every year we have a handful of senior auditors come and take the class. Once you reach a certain age in Wisconsin, you can do that for free. So if that's ever something you've been interested in, I welcome you to join us. And we teach it Tuesday and Thursday mornings. We usually get like 8 to 10 senior auditors every fall. They seem to love it. We get good feedback. So yeah, that's something you're interested in. Check it out. We teach every fall, so it'll be this fall or in the future. But today, condensing limnology into one talk on the Clearwater phase. And I'm starting with this picture, which I took back in 2015-ish. I actually rented an apartment on the shores of Lake Monona. It was amazing. It was taken from my backyard. And on the left, you can see a picture of incredibly clear water. So what you're actually seeing are the plants, the aquatic macrophytes on the bottom in the sand. In Lake Monona, crystal clear water, unbelievable. And then, a month later, same place on Lake Monona, big scummy algal bloom that lasts for the rest of the summer. So we're going to be talking today about this phase, what causes it, why it's an exciting time of the year. Okay, so first of all, ecologists love lakes. There have been so many interesting parts of ecology written about lakes. And one of the reasons that ecologists love lakes. So we can kind of think of them as these really closed systems. We use this term microcosms a lot, which just means like we can simplify the system into this bounded box. And this is the opposite of what Clean Lakes Alliance usually talks about, which is like all the changes in the watershed impact the lakes, and they do. So we're going to forget about the watershed. We're just going to think about the lake. But the watershed is incredibly important. Don't, in an hour from now, think about it. But for the next, for this topic, we're thinking about just processes inside the lake. And why ecologists love thinking about lakes is that we can just think about what's going on inside of them and all of these cool interactions between the physics. And so when I say physics, I mean like the wind and the sun heating the lake and it, mixing around all the chemistry. So what's happening with, phosphorus and nitrogen, and then all the biology. So what's happening in the food web, phytoplankton, fish, and this figure is kind of one of the most famous figures in the field of limnology. And so again, limnology is a study of inland waters. But it was produced in 1940 by this grad student in Minnesota who was trying to think about how lakes functioned as a whole. And the 40s was a big time for ecology. It was like the term ecosystem had just been coined. And so this grad student went out to this bog in Minnesota and was trying to put all the pieces together. And what he kind of came up with was that there's all these different parts that are connected. So at the top, he had nutrients. So in purple here, he said that nutrients are really important. So things like phosphorus, right? They kind of make primary production possible. In blue, we have the primary producers, and this is a term for just like anything that's photosynthesizing. So you're converting energy from the sun into actual matter. So this is things like algae, but also plants. Then in the middle here in gray, we have, he called it ooze, but we would call these the microbes today. So all of the microbes that are driving nutrient cycling and shunting chemicals around. Microbes do a ton in lakes. Then in the sort of like the orange color here, we have our zooplankton. So these are tiny animals, and they're the sort of the middle of the food chain. They're eating algae, but then they're also being eaten by fish. And then down in green, we have our higher trophic levels, our small fish, our big fish, any of the kind of predators in a lake. And this figure was like, we use it all the time now, but in the 40s, it was really informative in terms of all of these parts of the lake are connected. And you can take any of these arrows and look at them in really, really finite detail, or you can kind of try and think about the system as a whole. So if we take this food web and think about how we normally draw a food web in lakes, they look more like this, where we can think about the benthic food chain. So this is all the stuff happening near the shore of a lake. So we have, algae growing on rocks, we have macroinvertebrates, and we have fish eating those, fish that like hang out in the near shore. And then we have our pelagic food chain. So this is everything that's happening in the middle of the lake. So we have our phytoplankton, our algae. We have our zooplankton. So these are our small animals that are eating algae. And then we have our sort of fish that hang out, more in the middle of the lake that are eating zooplankton. And then we have lots of fish species that are also moving around, that are eating prey in both the benthic and the pelagic habitats. So these are all connected. You can see all these arrows going between all of them. But for the sake of today, we're going to mostly focus on this food chain. So we're going to focus on algae, zooplankton, and fish, ignoring all of the cool stuff that's happening near the shore of the lake. Okay, so we're going to dive into these guys a little bit. And we're going to get to the clear water phase, I promise. We're going to learn some basics first. So phytoplankton, what are they? Basically, they're tiny microorganisms that photosynthesize. And the definition is that they're microorganisms that are very small, but mighty, and they range, but they range in size. So you can have very tiny phytoplankton to ones that you can almost see with the naked eye. And what's sort of just crazy about phytoplankton in general is that if you look at the evolution and history of life on Earth, they're sort of everywhere in the evolutionary tree. They've evolved in all different parts of the eukaryotic tree of life. Some are kind of related to plants, and some are not related to plants at all. And yet they all photosynthesize and have different traits, but the commonality is the same, which is they photosynthesize and they float around in lakes. And there are thousands of different species. And so if you are someone who studies plankton, phytoplankton, hats off to you. It's extremely hard because there are so many species and you can't see them. You have to use a microscope. And so it's one of the reasons why when we have something like a algae bloom, it's hard to say what species are in it because there's so many different species. That said, we usually have some common ones in the Madison lakes, the ones that we see more often than others. And this is a microscope photo of cyanobacteria in the algae bloom, not from these lakes, but from a Minnesota lake. And what's interesting is that even in like a big bloom, you can see that there's lots of different species at the same time, which is kind of interesting from a scientific point of view. It's like, how can so many of these species coexist? Why is there not just one dominant phytoplankton species? There's been a lot of work on that in the field of limnology, trying to figure out this, they call it the paradox of the plankton. Like, why are there so many? And yet lakes are just this sort of constantly changing environment, which we think sets it up so that you don't have sort of one dominant species. And so all these different species can kind of find their own individual niche and not go extinct, I guess. And so cyanobacteria, if I go back, this is just the eukaryotic tree of life. Cyanobacteria are bacteria. So there's phytoplankton from a whole different side of the evolutionary history of life that also photosynthesize and also float around in lakes. So phytoplankton are just like really remarkably complex. And yet, for the most part, how we interact with them is that we are annoyed by them because there's too many of them in our lakes. And so if we think about that problem, which is like we have too many, what's happened? Why? So we think about the life and the death of a algae cell. There's certain things that it needs. So one of them is it needs light. So these are photosynthesizing organisms. So they need light to produce their own organic matter. And so the light affects that rate of photosynthesis. You have more light, you have more photosynthesis. We see that in our seasons. In the winter, we don't see a lot of plants growing. And in the summer, everything kind of comes to life as we get more light availability. And some of these species can still photosynthesize at really low levels of light. So we still see algae blooms in the lakes under ice in the winter. There's still enough light to be able to photosynthesize, which is pretty cool. Because if you think about it, a lake is not, even when it's frozen, it's like not as cold as the land, right? It could be 0 degrees outside, but in the lake, it's still, if you have enough light, you still get photosynthesis. But temperature plays a role. The warmer it is, the more things grow. That's true of most species on Earth. And so all species have sort of a preferred temperature range. So the warmer the water gets, the more algae you have. Some algae like cyanobacteria, like the blue-green algae that we don't like, tend to like really hot. So the hotter our lakes get, the more we get these cyanobacterial blooms. There's other species that you might have heard of, like diatoms, that have a preference. So they kind of like colder water a bit better. That's what we often see in the spring. Some of the lakes have been kind of brown lately, and that's been from like a lot of diatoms blooming. And those are just a different species of phytoplankton. Also, if you're a plankton, you have to stay afloat in the water. You are a tiny cell and you want to stay near the surface. So they have lots of different adaptations to basically stay at the surface of the lake, right? You don't want to be swept out. Especially in spring, you can imagine that like days like this where it's super windy and the lake's just like churning. If you're a tiny algae cell, you want to have adaptations to be able to stay in the water column. And then of course nutrients, right? Like plant food, you get algae, phosphorus, nitrogen, they're going to grow more. In a healthy lake, nutrients is often what's limiting that growth. Unfortunately, here in the summer, we have lots of nutrients, we have warm water, we have lots of light. So we're kind of setting up this perfect environment for like a lot of algae to grow. But then of course, at some point, right, cells eventually die. And so this can be from different pathogens. There's viruses, bacteria that break down algae cells, but they also get eaten by zooplankton. And sometimes they just like fall out of the water column and just sediment into the bottom of the lake. But we're going to mostly talk about getting eaten by zooplankton here, because zooplankton can eat a lot of algae if there's enough of them. So if we think about like how much phytoplankton's in a lake, we think about all these bottom-up controls: light, temperature, how the lake's mixing, how many nutrients they are. Those are all kind of controlling how much the algae can grow. So if you ramp these up, you ramp up your amount of like algal biomass. If you can limit any of these, then you can limit the amount of algal growth. Okay, so when we have too much of that, we get these algal blooms, right? We've all seen this, unfortunately, big blooms at the surface where algal growth is kind of out of control. So how do you prevent this from happening? Well, one thing is you can look at your top-down controls. And in this food web, that is zooplankton eating algae. So if you can have a lot of zooplankton in your lake, you can actually graze down that biomass. So you can imagine that, like, if you think of this as like they're out there grazing all of the algae. Okay, so zooplankton, also very diverse. Lots of species of zooplankton. It just means floating animal, basically. And they also are found in different parts of the evolutionary tree of life. But when we think about needing a lot of algae to graze down, needing a lot of zooplankton to graze down our algae, we really want to focus on the big guys. These are like the cows of the lake that can go out and eat a ton of algae. There's a lot of tiny zooplankton. They're not as helpful as these big ones in terms of just how much they can eat. So these are the sort of like the big crustacean zooplankton. These are the ones that, like, if you're holding a vial of water, you can see them with your eye. They're that big. And there's two main groups. There's our cladocerans and there's our copepods. Pepper of the zooplankton world are Daphnia. They are the ones that when there are a lot of them in the lakes, they can eat all of the algae. Not just some algae, all of it. And even within Daphnia, there are different Daphnia species. And this is important because Daphnia pulicaria are like really big, and some of the other Daphnia are not as big. And just that small difference in size and how much they eat can actually make a difference in how much algae we produce. So I'm going to show you guys Daphnia pulicaria, really big, have a pretty low temperature threshold, so they can start reproducing pretty early in the year, even when it's still the water's still cold. Daphnia mendotae don't eat as much. They also like warmer waters. And what we